Hello and welcome to the World Wanders podcast, your source for travel stories, travel destinations, and travel philosophy.
I'm Amanda.
I'm Ryan.
And we're your hosts.
Hello and welcome back to the World Wanders podcast. This week we are very excited to be talking about Monterrey, Mexico.
Yeah, and before we dive into our content on Monterrey, we wanted to give a little shout out and a big welcome to our newest patrons, Adam and Veronica. Welcome to the community. We're really excited to have you in the Patreon community with us.
Yeah, and so if you are interested in getting access to our new podcast series, The World Wanders Insider, where we're currently talking to and interviewing digital nomads about their journeys from finding out about working and traveling and how they built their careers doing it, how they're making money, and all of that good stuff. We're going really into detail with people and sharing those stories as our first series on the World Wanders Insider. If you'd like to get access to it, you can go to patreon.com/theworldwanders, sign up, and listen to all those amazing new podcast episodes.
Yeah, and I think there's 4 up there now, so there's lots of content for you guys to listen to already, which is super, super awesome. All right, now on to the episode talking about Monterrey. And so Monterrey is in Mexico. It is in the state of Nuevo Leon. And Nuevo Leon is actually in the northeast corner of the country. It's pretty much as northeast as you can go because Monterrey is actually only 2.5 hours from the Texas border.
Yeah, and Monterrey, because of that proximity to the U.S., to a lot of big cities like Houston, is a very developed and a very business-focused city. It has the second highest GDP in Mexico and is rich in culture as well as business.
Yeah, and development. That's another one of the things that makes Monterrey a little bit unique from some other cities in Mexico, and it's definitely the most developed city that we've been to in Mexico. I mean, obviously, Mexico City is super, super developed and has a ton of different stuff, but Monterrey has a little bit of a different feel to it. You feel the development through the sky rises and the big interstates. I've never seen big interstates in a Mexican city quite like there are in Monterrey. And it has a really different feel and a different vibe than some of the other Mexican cities that we visited.
Yeah, and talking to Mexicans around Mexico, a lot of them will tell you that Monterrey is Mexico's most American city. And so I think you might go in thinking that and find some confirming evidence, but you do feel that in certain ways. Certain things that might remind you of Texas if you're in Monterrey, in terms of the interstates, the big signs, some of the malls, the strip malls, the restaurants that are there, and one small detail that actually makes it seem like Mexico's most Canadian city as well.
Yeah, they have Tim Hortons there, which for those of you who are not familiar with Tim Hortons, it is Canada's version of Dunkin' Donuts. And that was a really kind of strange, nice treat. And when I posted it on Instagram, people were like, wait, where are you? And I was like, I'm still in Mexico.
Yeah, it's so funny. I think within maybe 20 minutes of driving, the airport's, as normally the case, was set out from the city. So driving in an Uber, I think we saw one on the side of the road and we're like, oh, whoa. I think I'd heard about it, but then just clicked that I saw it and was like, oh, that's really strange.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so Monterrey is actually settled into a really interesting location as well. I think sometimes you hear commercial city, industrial city, and you think, okay, don't want to travel there. Monterrey is settled right into the kind of a nest of mountains. So kind of in almost all directions, there's mountains. And there's actually an interesting divide between some of the newer areas and the older areas of the city that are split off by a river and another series of mountains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's beautiful. Like one of the first things that I really noticed outside of the development and the big, interstates and the street signs was the mountains. It's like you're in this valley just surrounded by these stunning mountain ranges on every side of Monterrey.
Yeah, and so for us, we went to Monterrey this past fall in between our time in Guadalajara and Mexico City. And what kind of drew us to wanting to go to Monterrey?
I think it was just hearing things from other people. People told us things like it is the most developed city in Mexico. It's the most Americanized city in Mexico. The food's different. The culture's different. We'd heard that it was really beautiful there, that both like the skyline and the city skyline were really stunning, but that it was also really accessible to nature. There was tons of different activities that you could do in nature. And I think for us, really loving Mexico, it's always really cool to discover a new state, a new culture within the Mexican culture, and then also to just see, some of these really big, cool, interesting cities.
And something we've talked about before on this podcast and a number of other episodes about Mexico is that one of the great things about being in Mexico are there's so many places to go, and there's so many ways to do it affordably. There's lots of discount air carriers, so we're able to find affordable flights in between Guadalajara and Mexico City to connect through Monterrey and get to know a new city, and as well kind of like dip our toe in a whole new area of the country. We had at least one friend go to that area and travel around and post photos from all the amazing outdoor activities you can do near Monterrey, and I think that really got us intrigued about what the city had to offer.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, or like Ryan said, we were there for a couple of days. So I think we had 5 days in total, and we were balancing, work with play for this trip. So when we take kind of smaller trips like this, especially to a new city, we don't normally stop working altogether. Sometimes we do, just kind of based on context. For us, we were heading into a really busy time period with Ryan's birthday, Day of the Dead in Mexico City, heading straight into Costa Rica, where we had a busy couple of weeks. So for us, we couldn't take the whole time off, but we balanced it nicely between working a little bit and then getting out to adventure a little bit. And one of the great things about working in a city like Monterrey is that there are a ton of great cafes. So we were able to, head out for the day, have a great meal, go work for a couple hours at a cafe, explore a little bit, eat again, et cetera, et cetera. Day goes on. One of the things that we found a little bit challenging with Monterrey was actually finding an Airbnb in an area that we wanted to stay in. You did most of the research with that. Can you talk a little bit about how we found and decided where we wanted to stay?
Yeah, there's definitely a couple different areas in Monterrey that you can stay in, and it's the type of city where there doesn't really seem to be a clear you should stay in this area. We ended up finding an Airbnb not far from San Pedro Garcia, which is kind of a newer, maybe a little bit fancier part of town. We were kind of in between there and the more old core of the city. But there's also a historic center you can stay in. You can stay close to the university. So lots of different options. And it does kind of feel like the type of place where if you're going to be there traveling around, you're going to need to be driving, getting Ubers anyway. So it's not, I feel like, not too much of an issue to worry about exactly where you're going to be staying.
Yeah, absolutely. We always really love to walk around places. It's one of the ways that we like to discover a new city. And just where our Airbnb was, it was a bit of a challenging area to walk around just because of the big highways. I mean, it's just not safe to walk on the side of like a 6-lane interstate that's high off the ground. And so we ended up taking Ubers a lot of places, and it felt more of like a driving city to us while we were there, but that was no problem. Uber was super easy. It was super affordable, and it was super convenient. So we still had a great time, and we stayed at an Airbnb that was really nice, that fit our needs perfect, that was affordable and had a beautiful view. So we really enjoyed that. And next, we're going to talk a little bit about what we did in the city. And so we did quite a bit of stuff.
Yeah, how about we start with kind of the premier attraction for us?
Okay. Sounds good. What's the premier attraction to you?
What was the premier attraction to you?
So I think for me, it was the Via Ferrata, Ruta Vertigo.
Yeah, and so do you want to give a bit of an overview about that? I know if you're listening and you listened to our year-end review, you heard us talking about the Via Ferrata near Monterrey. It was one of our highlights for the year, but do you want to give a bit of an overview of what that was all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So our good friend Rory, who you've heard on the podcast a couple of times before, had been to Monterrey a couple of months back while he had been traveling around Mexico. And he said, if you're going to do anything in Monterrey, I think he said eat at Tacos Orinoco, which we'll talk about when we get to the things that we ate. We definitely ate there. And he said, and do the Via Ferrata. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. That sounds great. So I looked it up. I found a couple different companies. I asked him which company they went with. It looked pretty cool. Basically, for those of you who don't know, a Via Ferrata is, it's. I actually don't know the background of the word.
I don't know the background of the word. I think technically it's like assisted rock climbing. So rock climbing where you're using bar is built into the mountain.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's really interesting though, because we have a Via Ferrata in Banff, and you can find a couple of Via Ferratas around the world, and everywhere they're called a Via Ferrata. So they don't change names based on the language, which is really interesting. But so I've done the Via Ferrata in Banff. It was super fun. You get strapped into a harness and you do things like you climb up, some rocks. There's some like handholds for it. You go across some like bridges and you get some really cool views, and it works really well in mountainous areas. And so we figured okay, it'll be really similar to that. And it definitely was, but I feel like it was like the Mexican version of a Via Ferrata. If you've been to Mexico, you know what we're talking about.
Yeah, leading up to it, we were a little bit uncertain, like obviously thinking about, okay, is this going to be safe? Is this going to be secure? Wondering kind of what the level was going to be. But I think when we got there, we're really surprised by the level of difficulty, which ended up being really rewarding, but definitely made some challenges along the way. Do you want to kind of describe what the day was like doing the Via Ferrata?
Yeah, and I actually want to describe the process beforehand too, just in case anyone does decide to do this and feels alarmed by the Mexican process of payment. So we decided to go with a company called Geo Aventura, and we had a really great experience with them. So I would definitely recommend that if you do want to have this experience, to do with them. They don't have an online booking forum, so I ended up sending a WhatsApp message to them, and they confirmed everything for me and then sent me an email with all the information, with the time, the location, where we get picked up from, and then a bank account number. And I had to go deposit cash. And the way that you do that in Mexico is you go to an OXXO, which is a convenience store. And so I think it cost us about $100 per person for the experience, which is super reasonably priced. But it's always a little sketchy when you're taking like $200 in cash, which is quite a bit of pesos, and you're depositing it into a bank account through it's the same system that you go buy like a bottle of water or a bag of chips from at a convenience store, and they just print you out this little receipt, and they'll doubly confirm that you've got the right bank account number. So you have to make sure you write it down super well. And so we have spent a lot of time in Mexico, and we're kind of familiar with things like this. We've done it for airlines and bus tickets and stuff like that in various different Latin American countries. But if you're coming from a different country, this is a totally weird and sketchy way to do things. And still, it kind of makes me feel a little bit uncertain. So just want to preface with saying that if you do want to do it with this company, we had a good experience like that. There are a couple other companies that do it as well, though, so you could research them also. So we were booked. We showed up at this location super early in the morning. I think we met at 6 a.m. or something like that, kind of outside the national park. A guy picked us up. It was us, so the two of us, and then one other girl for our tour, and then two guides. So there was 5 of us in total, which was a really nice group size. He picked us up and drove us to the base of a mountain, set us up with all of our gear, so harnesses, a helmet, a headlamp, and then we started hiking. And we hiked up in the dark, so you can't see anything. You're looking down because there's cactuses and stuff, because it's a dry environment. You just don't want to prick yourself. I think we hiked for maybe 30 minutes or something like that till we got to the base of a mountain.
Yeah, of a sheer cliff.
And then we strapped in our harness and started pulling ourselves up the mountain.
And so it was dawn around this time, just starting to become light out, where we start climbing. And I think we were just going straight up for a couple hours.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I guess not really fully straight up, because you do a bunch of different stuff to go up. We started by kind of rappelling ourselves backwards, which was definitely the hardest part and the first thing we did. And then we kind of climbed using sort of bars that were in the wall as hand and footholds. And then, we would stop to take in the view and stuff like that. And there was different ledges you could sit on and get photos taken. And we went across a bridge, and then we hit the ladder, which was probably for me the only point that I was actually scared. It was safe, I think. But it's kind of crazy. I'll describe it for you. So if you don't like heights, maybe just skip ahead a couple of minutes, because this was got my palms sweating. And I'm not afraid of heights. If you guys have listened for a while, you guys know we've jumped off buildings and bridges and out of planes and stuff. Neither of us are really fearful of heights, but this definitely gets your like blood pumping in a different way. So you've got a harness, you're strapped in, but what you have to do is you have to switch your harness as you go up. So there's like sets of wire cables that you're held into. And there was 2 like normal sized or big kind of ladders that were...
I think it was actually 3 full-size ladders wired up, so they're hanging just like not free hanging, but the hanging in the air, completely vertical.
Yeah, and so the mountain is like to your back, and that's where your harness is like hooked into a like wire that's on that side. And then you're climbing up these ladders, and so there was 3 of us spread out, and so we went like I think there was 3 or 4 meters in between us. So by the time I went second, and by the time Ryan got on below me, it was shaking because there's 3 of us climbing these ladders, and we have like not much more than the size of your body and your backpack away from the wall. So it's a really small space, and you look out in front of you and you're just like, there's nothingness because the mountain's behind you, and you look down and it's like a sheer cliff face.
So yeah, hundreds of feet down to the ground, because this is probably an hour and a half since we began climbing.
Yeah, like we are up on a mountain at this point.
And your hands are sweaty, your arms are tired, your legs are tired.
But you like, there's nothing you can do. Like, even if you fell, like if you fell, you'd be fine because you'd be like strapped in there. But like, there's nothing you can do. Like you can't just get off the mountain. Like it was pretty intense at that point.
Going down would be way worse than going up.
Oh, absolutely. And so it's definitely like a physical challenge as well as a mental challenge for sure. And I think that I'm really glad we did it, but there was some definite moments, like the ladders were scary, but then once we got to the top, the view was stunning, and then going down was pretty fun. We got to like zip line and rappel, and climbing down's not so fun, but...
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to lie, when we got to the top, I was like, okay, thank God, but like, I just want to get off this mountain. Like, how fast can we get down? And it was incredible views up there. And then you zip line from kind of one peak to a next peak, and then you start rappelling down, and you do a climb down and then 2 larger rappels down. And then you're down to where the hike started and do about 30 minutes out. How long in total did it take? It was like 6 hours?
I think about 6 hours. And I think that it's definitely different based on like the speed of your group and how many people you are, because part of it is that like, you know, the front guide and the back guide are kind of like setting the pace with whoever is there, and they have to help you with certain things as you go just to make sure that you're safe. And then of course, like if you're the second person, you can't pass the first person because you're strapped into harnesses on the side of a mountain. So you really have to go like at a pace of the group, which I think is good. It means that you're like keeping a pretty steady pace but not going too fast. Like I never felt like it was too much or anything like that. It was pretty good.
Yeah, I would say if you're considering doing this, we were both in like relatively good shape while we were in Guadalajara for 7 weeks before we were going to the gym really consistently. So having like a solid degree of fitness, I say, is a requirement, probably more so than you kind of get the impression based off the booking. I think we were surprised of like, oh, wow, they didn't ask us like any questions about our fitness levels. But yeah, you want to make sure like if you have kind of challenges when it comes to certain movement stuff, like you're going to be out doing some like hard physical work, and there's not really much of a way out. You got to go up because you can't really go back down.
Yeah, and then you have to go down the way that it's planned to go down. I would also just say if you're like afraid of heights, that maybe this activity is not for you, since it gave us a little bit of the jeeps at some points.
Yeah, I'm like, I think reasonably afraid of heights. Like I don't feel like at ease when I'm really high in the air and there's nothing like guarding me, you know?
Yeah.
Which I feel like is normal. It's like that would be a problem if you didn't feel like, oh, my heart's beating faster, my nerves are going. But I think there's something, I feel like I do well with like a roller coaster, a tower of terror, something that's like momentary, bungee jumping, skydiving. It's like, okay, it peaks, you're dealing with that feeling, and then you're jumping out. But there's something different where you're just hanging out with that feeling for like minute after minute after hour after hour. It's just like, I've been afraid of heights for 3 hours in a row, and you're like, I just want to get off this mountain.
Yeah, absolutely. But so if this does not sound like the thing for you, but you are kind of interested in getting into the mountains, so it's in Parque La Huasteca in the Huasteca Mountains, and there's tons of stuff to do out there. So if you go to GeoAventura's website, you can look at another Via Ferrata that's not as intense as the Ruta Vertigo, like the vertical route. And you can also look at some of the other activities they offer. Like you can go do canyoning, and there's other hiking you can do and stuff like that. So
I think there might be whitewater rafting in that area as well.
Yeah, there's lots of outdoor stuff to do. So you don't necessarily have to choose to climb straight up a mountain to enjoy what the Monterey area has to offer. But we were recommended to do this activity, and it was definitely like very, very fun.
Yeah, and even closer to Monterrey, there's a couple hikes that you can do. One that was like an abandoned cable car station that you can go hiking around. But so many really cool outdoor activities. I feel like that's something that really defines Monterrey. Like if you're not someone who likes that stuff, it might not be your city, but if you're someone who does, there's so many cool things to do in and around that city, in nature and in outdoor space, that I think would make it really, really great trip.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to your point about like maybe it's not your city, I actually kind of disagree with that. I think that Monterrey is a really great city because it's got all the nature stuff, but there's plenty to do in the city that has nothing to do with nature. So I think there's tons of stuff for all types of people.
Okay.
So one of the other things that we did, which was, I guess, not really like a full-on hike, but more of an outdoor, I guess, walking experience, is we did go up to a cerro, or a viewpoint. It's called the Priest Viewpoint, or Jardines de Cerro, and it's marked in the city by this gigantic Mexican flag. So when you're driving around, you see it, and you can take an Uber or a car up to a certain point, and then you walk up to the top of the viewpoint. And we actually went right at dusk as the sun was setting, so we got to watch the city go from kind of that daytime vibe into the nighttime vibe. And Monterrey is massive. It's got tons of buildings, tons of lights, and we both really love looking at cities as they twinkle in the nighttime. So it was cool to watch the sunset, and it was also really cool because we got to watch the sunset over the Huasteca Mountains, which is where we did the Via Ferrata. So it was cool to be able to like see that from a distance.
Yeah, a really cool place. Definitely a must do if you're in Monterrey. And you really get a sense for the scale and scope of the city. It's really gigantic, and it goes in all directions, weaving its way through valleys and mountain ranges out into the distance as far as you can see.
Yeah, absolutely. Something else that's a bit more, I guess, outdoorsy and that is really popular in Monterrey that you'll hear. If you ask any local about something to do, they'll suggest going to Fundadora Park, or Parque Fundadora. And that means the Founders Park?
It's actually Foundries
Park.
And so that connects back to Monterrey kind of being like the Pittsburgh of Mexico, the home of the steel industry, and really responsible for a lot of the development of that industry. And so one of the old foundries and kind of area around the foundry has been converted into a really, really cool large park. And so in one of the foundries, there's actually now a museum. It's called Museo del Acero Horno 3. And so you actually can go up on top of like the old foundry ovens, I suppose, which actually gives you a bit of that like, oh, this seems
I feel like that may have almost been more frightening than the Via Ferrata.
You take one of the old elevators up, which is like a small car that I think in the past they used to take people and also some of the, I guess, the ore that would then be burnt, melted down. And then there's some cool like foundry experiences. You can go in and have an experience of like watching a show where they're like showing how the foundry's done with like pyrotechnics and lights. And then the museum space talks more about the process of making steel and a lot of the history. And then just around there, tons of space.
Yeah, absolutely. The park is definitely, we went on a weekday, so it wasn't super busy, but I can just imagine that like, you know, tons of people with bikes and out there running and walking, because there's a huge like kind of walking trail through there, and you can walk for ages there. And somebody had recommended that we rent bikes and do that. We decided to just walk and check out the museum, but renting a bike would get you through a lot more of the park a little bit faster. And it's cool because the park actually connects to Paseo Santa Lucia. And so there was an old, they called them like ojo de agua, like a eye of water. So like maybe an old natural spring. And they turned that into this area where kind of feels like an Italian canal or something like that.
Yeah, it's like a big river walk, and it goes all the way from Parque Fundidora, closer to the city center, to the Macro Plaza, I think right by one of the big museums downtown. And there's actually some boats you can take if you want to, or you can just walk the length of it, which is a nice walk, especially on a hot day. Being by the water, it's a little bit cooler.
Yeah, and there's definitely, places you can get food and drink along there. There's a couple restaurants and a couple bars, cafes, that type of thing. So that was actually something we did. We planned to just kind of walk it once, and I think we ended up walking it twice the day that we went to just go see that, and then we walked it again when we went to Parque Fundadora because we really enjoyed the walk. It's, like Ryan said, it's a little cooler in that area. It's like nice and relaxing. It feels kind of pleasant, like it's kind of that like in between walking fully in nature and, taking a nature walk in a city, which is nice. So it's always nice when you can end your walk with chips and guacamole.
Yeah, and so that section of the city, I'm going to call it like the older city center, which may or may not be technically correct, but it has lots of cool stuff. So at one end, and this is a walk we kind of did ourselves, of what's called the Macro Plaza, which is kind of a big central long plaza, essentially. And at one end is the Museum of Modern Art. At the other end is the Museum of Mexican History, and that connects to the Paseo, the Riverwalk, and then that connects all the way out to the Foundry Park. So you can go for a really nice long walk, check out a couple museums, maybe get a beverage or two along the way, and have a really nice experience in that part of town.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of my favorite things that we did while we were in Monterrey was we went to the Museum of Contemporary Art. On the outside of it, there's this big sculpture of a fat bird. It reminds me of like crazy Angry Birds. And I don't know, I was like, I feel like we should go into this museum. And so we did. And honestly, I think it's my favorite museum I've ever been to. It was so fun.
Yeah, there was a lot of cool like mix of technology and art exhibits going on there that were interactive, and I'm sure it's the type of thing that's always updating and changing, but definitely worth looking at. And we didn't actually go for a couple different reasons, but I've heard and we read that the Museum of Mexican History in Monterrey is actually really, really good as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So if you like museums, I feel like you could definitely spend a day or two kind of exploring that area and walking and kind of taking in all the history and the culture that Monterrey has.
And so when you're going to a Mexican city and traveling, the food is always going to have a big part of that experience. And so we're going to dive in and talk a little bit more about our food experiences in Monterrey. But first, we're going to take a very quick break.
All right, we're back, and we are diving into some of our favorite eats from Monterrey.
Yeah, and I have to say, in Monterrey, I think that there is a whole world of kind of that northern Mexican food options that we only scratched the surface of. But to start with that scratching, we went to a famous taco restaurant in Monterrey.
Yeah, it's a taco restaurant called Tacos Orinoco. And the original restaurant is in Monterrey, but they've actually grown a ton, and there are locations in Mexico City as well. And they're really known for their trompo.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny because you find when you're traveling somewhere like Mexico, I think this applies everywhere, but especially there, you kind of start learning the Spanish words for things, and you feel like you're in your bag, as the kids are calling it, where you're like, oh yeah, I got all the words I need. And then you show up at a new restaurant and then people refer to things by different things. And you're like, oh wait, what's that? And so trompo is actually the name of the mechanical spinning device that spins meat. So like you'd see when you go to a taco restaurant, when you go to a gyro restaurant, shawarma place, that is trompo. And so tacos trompo is actually basically the same as tacos al pastor. So you're getting pork meat. And at Orinoco, they don't have a ton of options, but you really don't need a ton of options because you're just going to get a few tacos, maybe a gringa or something like that. Lots of meat, delicious salsa, maybe a little bit of pineapple put on top. I'm feeling my stomach rumbling as I'm talking about it. But really, really good tacos and really good jamaica juice as well.
Yeah, and good roasted potatoes also.
Incredible potatoes. And then they have a really cool range of salsas. And it was one of those experiences where you get like a delicious hot salsa that's kind of like causing your insides to melt, but you just can't stop eating because the potatoes and the salsa is so good.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that's been kind of interesting for us is that we've spent so much time in Mexico and we've tried so many different types of local food, and yet there's still so many different things we haven't tried and so many different things we don't know about. And so going to Tacos Orinoco, we showed up and it was one of those times where I'm like, I don't know what to order because I don't know what these things on the menu are all about, because there was a lot of stuff that was really new to us. And so we were able to ask, and the lady walked us through, what they're famous for and what types of meats they were and that type of thing. One thing that I think I will say is that a lot of the traditional food in Monterrey felt a lot more like meat-based. So if you're not a meat eater, there are tons of like veg and vegan restaurants and stuff. We saw tons of different great places and marked a couple down, of course, but some of the traditional food feels a little bit more heavy on the meat side of things. And then even as somebody who's gluten-free, I don't normally worry in Mexico, but the closer you get to the US border, the more common using a flour tortilla actually is. So it's also important to just confirm that you're getting a corn tortilla. And this is one thing that Tacos Orinoco actually asks which one you want, and you have to clarify, which many other places in Mexico, it just wouldn't even be an option.
Yeah, so a couple things that make Monterrey or kind of unique and what Monterrey is known for is one, those wheat tortillas like you mentioned, and another is actually goat meat. So something called cabrito is kind of something where if you're going to Monterrey, people are going to ask you, oh, did you try cabrito, which you could get in taco form or other. It's actually roasted baby goat, which we actually did not try when we were there.
Yeah, so part of that for me is like feeling a little bit weird about eating a baby goat, which I understand if you eat any type of meat, you probably shouldn't be weird about certain types of meat. But I think also another part of it is that I don't really even think we came across it anywhere that we went. So did they offer cabrito at Tacos Orinoco?
I can't remember if they had it on the menu there. I know there's a couple restaurants where that's like what they're known for. And I remember thinking about going one time, and then I think we just went back to one of our restaurants that we enjoyed.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
but definitely something worth looking up, checking out if you're going. That's something that's really kind of unique and Monterrey is known for, and that the next time we're there, we'll probably have to check out.
Yeah, for sure. And so a couple other places that we ate at, we found an Ojo de Agua, which if you guys know me, it's one of my favorite restaurants in Mexico City. I was thrilled to find it in Monterrey. They have like the best chilaquiles for breakfast. So good.
Yeah, and that's something you'll have heard us talk about in Mexico City, in Guadalajara. It exists in most places. Not in most places. It exists in a number of places in Mexico. They're growing really rapidly because they're so awesome. And so kind of anywhere you're going, if it's a city in Mexico, worth checking out and seeing if there is one there.
Yeah, and then a couple of cool other little places that we discovered. One was Antelope Cafe. They had really good coffees and matchas and actually a really good breakfast menu. And I was able to get some gluten-free pancakes, which is always a treat. And cute little space right in, actually like this really cool little mall space in the center area of San Pedro Garza Garcia, which was sort of the bigger neighborhood that we stayed in. And there was sort of 3 little mall areas with a ton of different restaurants. There was a spin studio there and lots of different stuff. So definitely a cool area to check out. And Antelope Cafe had really good breakfast and coffee. We also ate at a Greek restaurant close to Tacos Orinoco called Opa. And we also ate at a place called J Poke Point, which was close to the Ojo de Agua, which was also in that area. And then we also paid a visit back to Cabana, which you guys have probably heard us talk about. It is one of our favorite restaurants also from Mexico City. And I just want to say, if anyone's listening, like, hey guys, like try some new restaurants. Yes, we hear that. We always try to try new restaurants. But honestly, when you find a good spot like Ojo de Agua or Cabana, it's really hard to not go to those places, especially because like we don't live in Mexico anymore. So it kind of feels like this, we don't get to have it that often. And so when we're in a city where we know we get to have it, it's like, okay, we got to take advantage of that. So that's just like a little bit of a, I guess, a challenge when you find something that you really do love, with balancing that with discovering something new that might be that next place you fall in love with.
Yeah, and so for us, our time in Monterrey was, I think, 4 days in total, right?
Yeah, 4 or 5, probably 4 total with flight stuff.
At least kind of one full day and a couple half days spent working as well. So it's kind of one of those things where, like, when you're traveling there as, you know, someone who's balancing work, traveling as a nomad, all the times that you do there, you know, you extend 4 days is enough to really dive in and see a ton of stuff. But if you're trying to balance with work, you end up having to kind of pick and choose. And so for us, we chose some of those Mexican favorites that we love and a few things to venture out, try new things, and especially focus on the doing as opposed to, you know, some other things that we could have been doing.
The doing plus the eating of Tacos
Yeah.
Orinoco. I think we went to Tacos Orinoco like 2 or 3 times.
Yeah, that was a go-to. It was funny. We ate there for the first time the day or 2 days before doing our big Via Ferrata hike. And I think as we were closing in on the last hour or two of the hike, all I was thinking about was just loading up on tacos and potatoes and then lying in bed for the rest of the day. I was like, okay, 1 p.m. now. We've been hiking since like 5:30 a.m. I'm going to take this Uber back to Tacos Orinoco. I'm going to stuff myself and I'm going to go to sleep for the rest of the day.
I think that's like actually what we did too. It was great. Mm-hmm. And so that pretty much sums up, you know, what we did, where we ate, and all the good stuff about Monterrey. But before we finish up the episode, overall, like, what were your thoughts about Monterrey? What would you do if you went back the next time? Do you recommend people go? How long would you stay for? All that good stuff.
Yeah, so I really loved having the opportunity to check it out. And I really do feel like for me, and maybe for us, hopefully you feel similarly, that it was kind of like dipping our toe in the water. Like almost going somewhere that you're like, okay, I want to see if this, going to this place kind of opens up more possibilities to go and travel more in this area, because I think that's something that I really do want to do. It's a really cool and interesting city. One of the things that's tough about Mexico, and a real blessing for us, is that we've had the opportunity to go to so many places. I think, like, if we were thinking about, okay, we've got 1 week and we've got to check out a few places in Mexico we've never been before, we might not go back for years. Maybe Monterrey doesn't hit that spot on the list. But for us, for me, it's definitely a place I want to go back to. So I think for me, the things that stand out are the outdoor, the nature stuff. Being so close to the mountains, it's a place I'd love to go back to, rent a car, and maybe stay a few days in Monterrey and go travel to a few places outside of town. Monterrey as well, it's a city that I think does a good job of showing and displaying that kind of contrast that exists in Mexico. It's got everything from like more historical Mexico, you know, based around the Museum of History, more of an historic old town. It's got its more recently old center of town. So the plaza area with the museums, that's an area that looks like it kind of grew and developed through the 70s, the 80s. And then it's got Garza Garcia, which is new, modern, incredible, giant skyscrapers. The type of place, if you looked at that from a distance and someone asked you, like, where is this? You might be like, Asia, the US, I don't know. But it's something that kind of clashes with a lot of people's views of what it means to be Mexico. And so you can kind of see all 3 or even 4, if you include the nature, of these sides of Mexico in one place, which I think makes it a really cool place to visit. It's got great food, great culture, interesting history, and incredible nature, which makes it a really cool, well-rounded destination. If you're somewhere that has access, like if you lived in Houston and you could drive, or you lived in San Antonio, you could drive down to Monterrey in 3-4 hours, I think that would be an incredibly cool trip to do. And one of those things that I think we get in our heads sometimes about, you know, once you cross that border, chaos is going to be there, and it's going to be something that you should feel nervous about. But I think that that's a city I would definitely explore if you had the option to go kind of cheaply and quickly from a lot of those places in Texas in the southern U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. You summed that up really well. I don't feel like I have too much to add to that. But yeah, I think you brought up a good point where like we've had the opportunity to explore a lot of Mexico. And I think that, there's still so many places on our list to go to, which is crazy. And we have quite a few friends who live in Mexico for a good chunk of the year, and they keep discovering new places, which means our list like keeps growing even as we check places off. And Monterrey had been something that we'd been curious about for a couple of years. Since we went down to Mexico, we'd been hearing things about Monterrey. And anytime we kind of hear things about a city, where people are like, oh, it's super modern, or it's super cool, it's really Americanized, there's lots of nature, those types of things kind of pique our interest. And so we wanted to go check it out and just see how it differed from the other areas. And I think, we can relate to this being from a really geographically large country. There's massive differences from one side to another. And I think that you get those even more in Mexico between, the most northerly states and the most southerly states. There is a huge difference between like the landscape and the geography and the climate and the traditional dress of the people and the history there, the food that they eat, the salsas that they use. Things are so different from state to state in Mexico, which is something that makes the culture of Mexico so rich, but also makes it just like such a fun place to discover. And I think, if you can swing it, like Ryan said, and you're pretty close to the Mexican border, either driving or flying in and out of Monterrey, I think is an amazing sort of weekend or long weekend spot. There's tons to do, like we've talked about, between the nature, the city stuff, the sightseeing, learning about the history, spending a whole afternoon at the Museum of Contemporary Art, whatever kind of floats your boat. There's lots of stuff for lots of people there. And it is a really, really cool city to discover.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so we'll make sure that everything that we talked about here, from the restaurants to the things to do, go up on a show notes post at theworldwanderers.com. So if you're checking out Monterrey, you can check out some of the places that we recommended. And yeah, if you are planning to go, we'd love to hear if you have any questions, or if you have been and there's something you really loved about Monterrey, definitely let us know. You can get in touch with us through all the different social media channels or in our Facebook group, The World Wanderers, a community for travelers, which you can just search on Facebook. Anything else?
I think that's all.
Yeah, and so until next time.
Thanks for listening.
To find more information, relevant links, and photos talked about in this week's episode, check out theworldwanderers.com.
If you have a question, comment, or feedback, send us an email at info@theworldwanderers.com. Join our community on Facebook at The World Wanderers or on Twitter at World Wanderers 1. As always, thanks so much for listening.
Have a great day.
Bye.